The day my son, Marcus, told me I needed to move out of my own apartment so his wife could have a proper space for entertaining, I was standing in my kitchen making his favorite peach cobbler from scratch. The irony wasn't lost on me. There I was, using my own oven in my own home, preparing his childhood comfort food while he sat at my dining table explaining why I no longer belonged there. I kept stirring the cinnamon into the peach filling, my wooden spoon moving in slow, deliberate circles, because if I stopped moving, I might have said something I couldn't take back. Or worse, I might have started crying right there in front of him. And I'd already given this family enough of my tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light streamed through the bay windows I'd saved 2 years to install, illuminating the dust motes dancing between us like tiny witnesses to this moment. Marcus shifted in his chair, the same mahogany chair I'd bought at an estate sale when he was 12, back when he still thought I hung the moon. His voice was matter-of-fact, almost gentle, as if he were discussing the weather rather than dismantling my entire world. "Mom, you have to understand. Vivian needs space to grow into her role as my wife. This apartment has all the character she's looking for, and honestly, it's wasted on just one person." He gestured around the living room where family photos covered every surface, where his baby shoes still sat in a shadow box on the mantel, where the walls held 43 years of memories I'd built one careful decision at a time. I am Norma Jean Watson, though most people just call me Norma, and until that Tuesday morning in October, I thought I understood my place in the world. I was the woman who raised a son alone after his father walked out when Marcus was barely walking himself. I was the one who worked double shifts at the textile factory to afford this rent-controlled apartment on Maple Street, the one with the built-in bookshelves and the clawfoot bathtub that I'd spent countless evenings soaking in after 16-hour days. I was the mother who never remarried because I poured all my love into making sure my boy had everything he needed, even when it meant I went without. The apartment had been our sanctuary for over 2 decades. It sits on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house, with windows that catch the morning sun just right, and hardwood floors that creak in all the familiar places. Every corner held a story. The kitchen where I taught Marcus to scramble eggs when he was 8, standing on a step stool and wearing an apron that dragged the floor. The living room where we built blanket forts during thunderstorms and where he later brought his first girlfriend to meet me, nervous and proud in equal measure. The second bedroom that had been his until he left for college, then gradually transformed into my sewing room, my reading nook, my space to breathe. When Marcus graduated with his business degree and landed a position at a marketing firm downtown, I was proud enough to burst. When he met Vivian at some corporate networking event, I welcomed her like the daughter I'd never had. She was polished and articulate, with perfectly straight blonde hair and a wardrobe that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. I told myself the slight chill in her manner was just nervousness, that she'd warm up once she got to know me. I invited them for Sunday dinners, sent care packages when Marcus mentioned Vivian was stressed at work, even offered to help plan their wedding, though they ultimately chose something far more expensive and exclusive than anything I could have contributed to. The changes started small, so subtle I barely noticed them at first. Marcus began visiting less frequently, and when he did come by he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and cutting visits short. Vivian rarely accompanied him anymore, and when she did she had a way of examining my furniture and decor with the expression I couldn't quite read. She'd run her fingers along the vintage coffee table I'd refinished myself, or study the collection of blue glass bottles on my windowsill with the kind of intense focus that made me wonder what she was thinking. During one particularly uncomfortable visit, she'd commented on how authentic everything looked, though something in her tone suggested authentic wasn't necessarily a compliment. I started noticing other things too. Marcus had stopped asking for my advice about anything meaningful. Gone were the days when he'd call to talk through a work problem or ask what I thought about a decision he was facing. Our conversations became surface-level exchanges about the weather and my health, polite but distant. When I tried to dig deeper, to ask about his hopes and dreams the way I used to, he'd deflect with jokes or change the subject entirely. It was as if he'd built an invisible wall between us, one I couldn't see clearly enough to understand why it was there. The apartment itself became a source of tension I didn't fully comprehend. Vivian would make comments about the charm of older buildings, always with that same inflection that managed to sound both appreciative and condescending. She'd mention how rare it was to find such character these days, then launch into descriptions of the modern high-rise condos her friends were buying. Marcus would nod along, adding details about stainless steel appliances and open floor plans that made everything feel so much more spacious. I'd smile and serve them tea from my grandmother's china set, the one with the tiny roses around the rim, and pretend I didn't notice how they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. The first real warning sign came during a dinner in late spring. I'd made Marcus's favorite pot roast, the one with carrots and potatoes that I'd been perfecting since he was in elementary school. Vivian picked at her food, mentioning she was trying to eat more plant-based meals, which made me feel foolish for not asking about dietary restrictions beforehand. Marcus seemed to enjoy the meal, but halfway through dinner, Vivian started talking about a friend of hers who'd recently inherited her grandmother's house. "Poor Sarah," Vivian said, cutting her meat into precise small pieces. "She's so overwhelmed trying to figure out what to do with all that space. Her grandmother lived there for 50 years. Can you imagine all that accumulated stuff, all those old-fashioned decorating choices? Sarah says it's like living in a museum." She paused to take a delicate sip of water. "Of course the house has good bones. Excellent location. Once she clears everything out and updates it properly, it'll be worth a fortune. Sometimes the best gift you can give the next generation is a fresh start. You know." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach, though I couldn't have articulated why. I just smiled and offered seconds, the way I always did, and steered the conversation towards safer topics like Marcus's work and whether they were planning any trips together. But that night, after they left, I found myself walking through my apartment with new eyes, seeing it the way Vivian might see it, the faded upholstery on my favorite armchair, earned through years of reading and evening television, the photographs covering the refrigerator, held up with an assortment of mismatched magnets collected over decades, the china cabinet filled with dishes I'd inherited from my own mother, pieces that didn't match any particular set, but told the story of celebrations and ordinary Tuesday night dinners alike. Summer brought more change. Marcus started mentioning their housing situation more frequently, though always in passing. They were living in Vivian's studio apartment across town, a modern space that apparently left much to be desired. "It's fine for now," he'd say, "but we're definitely outgrowing it. Vivian needs a proper home office for her freelance work, and we barely have room for all our things." He'd glance around my living room when he said this, his eyes lingering on the built-in bookcases and the large windows that filled the space with natural light. Vivian began dropping hints with increasing frequency. She'd comment on how lucky I was to have so much space all to myself, how rare it was to find apartments with such unique architectural details these days. She'd mention articles she'd read about older people downsizing, about how freeing it could be to simplify your life and reduce the burden of maintaining a large living space. I read this fascinating piece about Swedish death cleaning, she told me one afternoon while Marcus was in the bathroom. "It's about clearing out your possessions before you pass, so your family doesn't have to deal with it later." So thoughtful, really. I started to feel like I was being studied, evaluated, sized up for something I couldn't name. Every visit felt like an inspection, with Vivian's sharp eyes cataloging my belongings, and Marcus nodding along to her observations about space and potential, and missed opportunity. They'd discuss their housing search in front of me, describing their must-haves and deal-breakers with the enthusiasm of people who'd found exactly what they were looking for, but couldn't quite figure out how to get it. The direct approach came on a rainy Thursday evening in early September. Marcus arrived alone, which was unusual enough to set me on edge before he even spoke. He accepted my offer of coffee and settled into his father's old recliner, the one I'd never been able to bring myself to replace even though the leather was cracked and the mechanism stuck sometimes. He seemed nervous, drumming his fingers against the armrest, and avoiding my eyes in a way that reminded me of childhood confessions about broken dishes or forgotten homework. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important," he began, and I felt my heart rate quick. My first thought was illness, His or Vivian's. Something that would explain the distance and the strange conversations. Vivian and I have been doing a lot of thinking about our future, about the kind of life we want to build together. He paused, took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down with the careful precision of someone buying time. We've realized that this apartment would be perfect for us, the location, the character, the space for Vivian's business ventures. It has everything we're looking for. I sat perfectly still, processing his words while part of my brain insisted I must have misunderstood. Are you asking about finding a similar apartment in the building? I asked, though I already knew that wasn't what he meant. The other 2 units were occupied by long-term tenants, and besides, this was the only apartment with the bay windows and the renovated kitchen I'd spent years saving to update. Marcus shook his head, his expression serious but not unkind. No, I'm asking if you'd consider moving out so Vivian and I can take over the lease. I know it sounds like a big change, but think about it practically. You don't really need all this space anymore. It's just you rattling around in here.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And honestly, wouldn't it be easier to find something smaller, more manageable? Maybe one of those nice senior communities with activities and people your own age. The words hit me like a physical blow, though he delivered them in the same tone he might use to suggest a restaurant for dinner. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a piece of my understanding about my place in his life sliding out of alignment. He was 53 years old, capable of finding and affording his own housing, and yet he was sitting in my living room, asking me to give up the home I'd worked decades to create so that he and his wife could have it instead. Marcus, I said slowly, this is my home. I've lived here for 22 years. I've put thousands of dollars and countless hours into making it what it is. I gestured toward the kitchen, where new cabinet hardware and a carefully chosen backsplash reflected my taste and my savings. Why would I leave? He leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way that somehow made everything worse. Because you love me, Mom. Because you want to see me succeed and be happy. Vivian has these amazing ideas for entertaining, for building our professional network. This space has so much potential that you're not really using. Think about it. When's the last time you had a dinner party? When do you ever use the dining room for anything but storage? I looked toward the dining room, where my sewing machine sat on the table surrounded by fabric for a quilt I was making for a friend's new grandbaby. He was right that I didn't host dinner parties, but I'd never been that kind of person. My entertaining was smaller, more intimate. Coffee with my neighbor Mrs. Patterson on Sunday mornings, book club meetings, once a month where we discussed mysteries and drank wine from mismatched glasses, the occasional overnight visit from my sister when she was in town. But apparently, none of that counted as really living in Vivian's assessment of my space. I can't just leave, I said, and I heard the pleading note in my own voice that I hated. Where would I go? How would I afford to move? This apartment is rent-controlled, Marcus. Do you have any idea what market rate would cost me? He waved his hand dismissively, and I felt another piece of my heart crack. We'd help you find something appropriate. There are lots of options these days for people in your situation. Maybe it's time to think about your next chapter. You know, you've done such an amazing job raising me and building this place. But maybe now it's time to let the next generation take over. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. He was discussing my displacement as if it were a natural progression, an inevitable next step that any reasonable person would embrace, as if my 43 years of love and sacrifice had been leading up to this moment when I'd gracefully step aside and hand over everything I'd built to make room for his happiness. I stood up abruptly, surprising both of us. I need some time to think about this, I said, though I already knew what my answer would be. I just needed him to leave before I said something that would damage us both. This is a big decision, and I can't give you an answer right now. Marcus nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't arguing further. Of course, take all the time you need. Just remember what I said about this being good for everyone. Sometimes love means making sacrifices for the people who matter most to you. He stood and kissed my cheek, the same perfunctory gesture I'd received at the end of visits for months now. Vivian and I are really excited about the possibilities here. I think once you see how happy this would make us, you'll realize it's the right thing to do. After he left, I sat in my kitchen until well past midnight, drinking tea that had long since gone cold and staring at the walls I'd painted 3 different colors over the years before settling on the warm yellow that made everything feel sunny, even on overcast days. I thought about all the conversations I'd had in this room, all the homework I'd supervised at this table, all the birthday cakes I'd baked in this oven. I thought about the night I'd brought Marcus home from the hospital with pneumonia when he was 7, how I'd set up a bed for him on the living room couch so I could monitor his breathing from the kitchen. I thought about the morning he'd called to tell me he'd gotten his first real job, how I'd danced around this very room in my pajamas and fuzzy slippers, so proud I could barely contain it. This apartment wasn't just where I lived, it was the foundation of everything I'd built since his father left us. It was proof that I could create a home and a life on my own terms, that I could provide stability and love and beauty even without a partner or a large income. Every improvement I'd made, every piece of furniture I'd carefully chosen or refinished, every photograph I'd hung represented a choice and a sacrifice and a dream, realized through my own determination. The idea that I should give it all up because my son and his wife found it more appealing than what they could afford on their own felt like being asked to erase myself, not just to move, but to disappear entirely, to become a smaller, more convenient version of myself that would fit neatly into whatever space they deemed appropriate for a woman my age. The senior community he'd mentioned wasn't about finding me a better situation, it was about removing me from theirs. I finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, but I didn't sleep. I lay in my familiar bedroom, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, the whisper of wind through the old windows, the distant hum of traffic that had become the soundtrack to my adult life. In the morning I'd have to decide how to respond to Marcus's request, but I already knew that whatever I chose would change everything between us. The son who had once held my hand while crossing streets, and told me I was the best mom in the world, was asking me to make myself homeless for his convenience. And the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him the best life possible was finally understanding that love, for him, had become a one-way transaction. The next few days passed in a strange suspended state where everything looked the same but felt completely different. I went through my normal routines: morning coffee on the back porch, afternoon trips to the grocery store, evening television programs I'd watched for years, but it was as if I were viewing my life through glass, separated from my own experience by the knowledge that someone I loved considered it all expendable. Marcus called twice during that week, ostensibly to check on me, but really to gauge my reaction to his proposal. Both conversations were careful and strained, with him asking how I was processing everything, and me giving non-committal answers about needing more time. I could hear the impatience creeping into his voice, the assumption that any reasonable person would have agreed by now. On the second call he mentioned that Vivian had already started looking at furniture that would work well with the apartment's existing character, and I felt something cold and sharp settle permanently in my chest. I found myself cataloging my belongings with new eyes, not because I was planning to leave, but because I was trying to understand what Marcus and Vivian saw when they looked at my life. The china cabinet my mother had given me as a housewarming gift seemed suddenly shabby rather than sentimental. The photograph collages covering one wall of the hallway looked cluttered rather than cozy. Even my beloved bookshelves, packed with mysteries and biographies and poetry collections, accumulated over decades, seemed like the hoarding of someone who couldn't let go of the past. But then I'd catch sight of something that anchored me back to the truth of what this place meant. The growth chart penciled on the inside of the pantry door, marking Marcus's height from age 6 to 6. The windowsill herb garden I'd tended for 8 years, providing fresh basil and rosemary for countless meals. The bathroom mirror I'd hung at the perfect height after years of stooping to see myself in the previous one. These weren't the accumulations of someone living in the past. They were evidence of a woman who had built a real life, one choice at a time, one improvement at a time, one act of love at a time. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning in mid-October. I was in my garden, such as it was, a collection of pots and window boxes on the back porch where I grew tomatoes and flowers and herbs. The autumn air was crisp but not yet cold, perfect for the kind of outdoor puttering that had always brought me peace. I was deadheading my marigolds when I heard voices from inside the apartment. At first I thought I was imagining things. Then I realized Marcus must have let himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago, back when he was in college, and would sometimes stop by to do laundry or grab a home-cooked meal. But as the voices became clearer, I understood that he wasn't alone. I could hear Vivian's distinctive laugh, bright and musical, followed by comments I couldn't quite make out. I crept closer to the back door, feeling like an intruder in my own home. Through the kitchen window, I could see them moving through my living room, and my heart began to pound as I realized what was happening. They were measuring. Marcus held one end of a tape measure while Vivian stretched it across various spaces, calling out numbers that he jotted down in a small notebook. They were planning, calculating, redesigning my home as if they already owned. The couch will have to go, Vivian was saying as she surveyed my living room furniture. It's completely wrong for the space, but once we replace it with something more contemporary, open up this whole area, it'll be perfect for host. She gestured broadly, her hands sketching an invisible future where nothing I'd chosen remained. Marcus nodded, scribbling notes. What about the dining room? You mentioned wanting to turn that into your office. Exactly. That space is completely wasted as a formal dining room. Who does formal dining anymore? But as an office, with good lighting and maybe built-in shelving for my business files, it would be ideal. Vivian walked to the windows, testing how they opened, examining the hardware with the focused attention of someone planning renovation. I stood frozen on my own back porch, watching my life being dismantled and redesigned without my consent. They moved through my home with the confidence of people who had already made their decision, regardless of what I might say. Every comment about what would need to be changed or removed felt like a dismissal of not just my belongings, but my choices, my taste, my decades of creating a space that reflected who I was. The worst part was hearing the excitement in their voices. This wasn't a reluctant necessity for them. They were enjoying this, energized by the prospect of taking over my home and transforming it into something that suited them better. Vivian particularly seemed thrilled by what she called the possibilities, describing elaborate entertaining scenarios and business meetings she could host once the space was properly updated. Your mother's been here so long she probably doesn't even see the potential anymore, Vivian said, running her hand along my kitchen countertops. It's sweet, really, how attached older people get to familiar things. But once she's settled somewhere more appropriate, she'll probably wonder why she held on to all this space for so long. Marcus made a non-committal sound that might have been agreement. She'll come around, she just needs time to adjust to the idea. Mom's always been practical about these kinds of decisions, once she thinks them through. Practical, as if my reluctance to hand over my home was simply a failure to think clearly rather than a fundamental resistance to erasing my own life for their convenience. As if my attachment to the place I'd built from nothing was a quirky emotional barrier they just needed to help me overcome. I quietly slipped back into my apartment through the front door, making enough noise to announce my presence. When I walked into the living room, they both turned to me with expressions of guilty surprise, like children caught raiding a cookie jar. Hi Mom, Marcus said, too brightly. We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by. Hope that's okay. I looked at the tape measure still in his hand, at the notebook Vivian was trying to casually slide into her purse, at the way they were both standing just slightly too far apart, as if they'd been caught in the middle of something they couldn't explain. Of course it's okay, I said calmly. This is still my home. You're always welcome here. I emphasized the word still just enough to let them know I'd understood exactly what I'd witnessed. Vivian recovered first, her smile bright and practiced. Norma Jean, you have such a lovely space here. We were just admiring how well you've maintained everything over the years. Her tone was warm, but her eyes were calculating, already seeing past me to the changes she wanted to make. Thank you, I replied. I've put a lot of love into this place. It's been my sanctuary for over 2 decades. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one Marcus had just been measuring for replacement, and smiled at them both. Were you looking for anything in particular? They exchanged a glance, and I saw the moment they decided to be honest, or at least their version of honest. Actually, Mom, we were getting excited about the possibilities here, Marcus said, settling onto my couch with forced casualness. Vivian has some amazing ideas about how to maximize the space, really make it work for our lifestyle. We thought maybe seeing it through her eyes, might help you understand why this could be such a great opportunity for all of us. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral. I see, and what kinds of changes were you thinking about? Vivian's face lit up, and I realized this was the opening she'd been waiting for. Oh, there's so much potential here. The bones of the space are absolutely perfect, but with some strategic updates, it could be truly spectacular. Modern furniture that doesn't overwhelm the architectural details, better lighting, maybe some accent walls to create visual interest, and functionally, we could reconfigure things to be so much more efficient. She launched into an enthusiastic description of her vision, and I listened with growing amazement at how thoroughly she'd planned to erase my presence from my own home. The living room would be opened up with sleeker furniture arranged for better conversation flow. My dining room would become her office, with filing cabinets and a modern desk replacing the antique table where I'd served thousands of meals. Even my bedroom would be optimized with built-in storage and a color scheme that was more sophisticated than my current warm yellows and blues. As she spoke, I realized that this wasn't just about wanting my apartment, it was about wanting it without any trace of me, without any reminder that someone else had lived here and loved here and built a life here before they arrived. They didn't want to inherit my home, they wanted to colonize it, to strip away every evidence of my existence, and start fresh as if the previous 22 years had never happened. Marcus watched my face carefully as Vivian outlined her plans. What do you think, Mom? Can you see how much happier this would make us? How perfect this place could be for the life we're trying to build together? I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 65 years in my bones. I think, I said carefully, that you've put a lot of thought into this, more thought than you've put into where I would go or how I would live, or what this would mean for me. Vivian's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. Of course we've thought about that. There are so many wonderful options for people in your stage of life. Retirement communities with activities and social opportunities, smaller apartments that are easier to maintain. Sometimes change can be really liberating. My stage of life, I repeated. And what stage is that? Exactly. The question hung in the air between us, and I saw both of them struggle with how to answer it honestly, because the truth was, they saw me as someone whose active life was essentially over, whose needs and desires were less important than theirs, whose role had shifted from protagonist to supporting character in the story of their ambitions. You know what I mean, Marcus said finally. You're at a point where you can simplify, focus on enjoying your retirement, instead of maintaining all this. He gestured around the room as if my home were a burden I was too stubborn to recognize. I nodded slowly. I see.
So this is really about doing me a favor, helping me recognize that I don't need or deserve the space I've worked decades to afford. Encouraging me to accept that my time as the central character in my own life is over. That's not what we're saying. Vivian protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I asked. Because what I'm hearing is that you've decided my home would serve your purposes better than it serves mine. That your plans and dreams matter more than my security and comfort. That I should be grateful for the opportunity to make myself smaller so you can expand. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Mom, that's not fair. We're not trying to hurt you, we're trying to find a solution that works for everyone. A solution that works for everyone. I repeated, except that your solution requires me to give up everything while you give up nothing. Your solution asks me to sacrifice my home, my stability, my independence so that you can have what you want without having to work for it, or wait for it, or earn it yourselves. The silence that followed was heavy with things none of us wanted to say out loud. I could see them both realizing that I wasn't going to be as easy to convince as they'd hoped, that my attachment to my own life was stronger than their sense of entitlement to it. Think about it, Mom, Marcus said finally, his voice taking on a harder edge. What's really best for everyone here? You rattling around in all this space you don't really use, or Vivian and I building something meaningful, creating a home where we can entertain and network and really make something of ourselves. And there it was, the assumption that had been lurking beneath every conversation, every hint, every measuring tape. That my life as I was living it didn't count as something meaningful, that my quiet contentment was less valuable than their social ambitions, that I was wasting what they could use better. I looked at my son, This man I'd raised with every ounce of love and determination I possessed, and saw someone I barely recognized. When had he become the kind of person who would sit in his mother's living room and explain why she deserved less? When had my love and sacrifice transformed into this sense of ownership over my choices, my space, my future? I need you both to leave now, I said quietly. They looked surprised, as if they'd expected me to continue debating the merits of their plan. Mom, Marcus started, but I held up my hand. No, I've heard enough for today. I need you to leave so I can think about everything you've said. I walked to the front door and opened it, standing aside to let them pass. They gathered their things slowly, clearly reluctant to end the conversation without the resolution they'd been hoping for. At the door, Marcus turned back to me with an expression that might have been intended as reassuring. Just remember, Mom, we're family. Family takes care of each other, makes sacrifices for each other. I know you'll do the right thing. After they left, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding with an anger so pure and cold it surprised me. The right thing, as if there were only one right thing, and it happened to be exactly what they wanted. As if my years of doing right things for him, working double shifts, going without, saving every penny for his education and his opportunities, had been leading up to this moment when I'd prove my love one final time by erasing myself from my own life. I walked through my apartment, seeing it with new eyes again. But this time I wasn't cataloging its flaws or imagining how others might judge it. I was remembering why I'd chosen each piece, why I'd arranged things the way I had, why this space worked for me exactly as it was. The dining room that Vivian wanted to convert to an office was where I'd hosted Marcus's birthday parties for 15 years, where I'd taught him to play chess on rainy afternoons, where I still ate my meals while reading books or working crossword puzzles. It wasn't a waste of space. It was the center of my daily life. The living room they wanted to open up with modern furniture was arranged for comfort, not display. Every sightline was chosen for my preferences, every piece of furniture positioned where I could use it easily. The photographs they found cluttered told the story of my life, my friendships, my achievements, my joy. They weren't decor to be updated. They were evidence that I had lived fully and loved deeply, and created a world that reflected my values. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to argue with Marcus and Vivian anymore. I wasn't going to explain why their request was unreasonable, or try to help them understand what they were asking of me. I was going to show them exactly what it meant to demand that someone give up their home for your convenience. I was going to give them what they'd asked for, but not in the way they expected. If they wanted to learn about sacrifice and family loyalty and doing the right thing, I was going to be an excellent teacher. And the first lesson was going to be about the difference between giving and taking, between love and entitlement, between family support and family exploitation. They thought they were asking me to make a simple transition, a practical adjustment, that any reasonable person would accept. What they were about to discover was that there are some lines you don't cross, some sacrifices you don't demand, and some prices that are too high to pay for anyone's happiness, even your own child's. The war was about to begin, but they didn't know it yet, and the first battle would be fought on terrain of my choosing, with weapons they'd never seen coming. The first thing I did the next morning was call my landlord, Mrs. Chen, a 70-year-old woman who owned the Victorian house I'd lived in for over 2 decades. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the familiarity of someone who'd collected my rent checks personally for years and always stopped to chat about her grandchildren, or my garden. Norma Jean, how lovely to hear from you. Is everything all right with the apartment? You never call unless something needs fixing. There was genuine concern in her voice, the kind that comes from knowing someone's patterns and rhythms well enough to notice when they shift. Actually, Miss Chen, I wanted to ask you about something rather unusual, I said, settling into my kitchen chair with a cup of coffee. What would happen if someone else wanted to take over my lease? Someone in my family, specifically. Would that be something you'd consider? There was a pause and I could almost hear her frowning through the phone. Well, that would depend on several factors. The lease is in your name, so technically you'd have to break it first, which would forfeit your security deposit and possibly incur penalties. Then the new tenant would have to apply and be approved, pay their own security deposit, and sign a new lease at current market rates. Why do you ask? Are you thinking of moving? My son has expressed interest in the apartment, I said carefully. I'm trying to understand what that would involve, financially and legally. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Norma Jean, you know I've always been fond of you. You've been an ideal tenant, never late with rent, never caused problems, always maintained the place beautifully. But I have to tell you, if you moved out tomorrow, I'd have to rent that apartment for at least 3 times what you're currently paying. Maybe more. The market has changed dramatically since you moved in. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. I'd known intellectually that my rent-controlled apartment was a rare find, but hearing the actual numbers made Marcus's request even more audacious. He wasn't just asking me to give up my home. He was asking me to hand over what amounted to a financial windfall that would cost him thousands of dollars more than I was paying. 3 times, I repeated. So if someone wanted to take over right now, they'd be looking at what kind of monthly payment? At least $4,500, probably closer to $5,000. These old Victorians with original details and this location, they're gold mines now. I've had people knock on my door asking if any units are coming available. She paused again. Norma Jean, please tell me you're not being pressured to move, because if you are, you need to know your rights. A landlord can't force you out to raise the rent, and family members certainly have no legal claim to your housing. I assured her I was just gathering information, but her words stayed with me long after we hung up. $5,000 a month. Marcus made good money at his marketing firm, and Vivian had her freelance consulting business, but that kind of rent would stretch even their combined income significantly. No wonder they'd prefer to convince me to leave voluntarily rather than pay market rate for their own place. The second call I made was to my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an 82-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived in the apartment directly below mine. We'd developed a comfortable friendship over the years, bonding over our shared love of mystery novels and our mutual appreciation for quiet living. She was also one of the most observant people I'd ever known, with a teacher's instinct for noticing details others miss. Dolores, I said when she answered, do you have a few minutes to chat? I could use some advice from someone with perspective. Of course, dear. Come down whenever you like. I just put on a pot of tea, and I've got some of those lemon cookies you enjoy. Miss Patterson's apartment was a mirror image of mine, but decorated in warm browns and deep reds that reflected her more traditional taste. She settled me in her living room with tea and cookies, then fixed me with the kind of steady gaze that had probably kept countless 7th graders honest over the years. Now then, she said, what's troubling you? And don't try to pretend it's nothing. I've lived long enough to recognize the signs of someone wrestling with a difficult decision. I found myself telling her everything. Marcus's initial request, the measuring and planning session I'd witnessed, Vivian's detailed redesign schemes, and my growing realization that they saw me as an obstacle to their happiness, rather than a person with my own legitimate needs and desires. Mrs. Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes, sipping her tea and studying my face with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Finally, she set down her cup and leaned forward slightly. Norma Jean, I'm going to tell you something that might sound harsh, but it comes from a place of caring. What your son is asking you to do isn't love. It's exploitation dressed up in family obligation. I've seen this pattern before, both in my teaching years and in my personal life. People who confuse taking with receiving, who mistake their parents' love for an unlimited resource they can withdraw from without ever making deposits. Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel but because they were true. But he's my son, I said weakly. Everything I've done has been for him. How can I say no when he needs something from me? What he needs, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, is to learn that love doesn't mean taking everything someone is willing to give. What he needs is boundary. What he needs is to understand that your life and your security matter just as much as his wants. She reached over and patted my hand. Sweetie, you raised a successful, educated man with a good job and a wife. He doesn't need your apartment. He wants it because it's easier than finding and paying for his own. But what if saying no damages our relationship permanently? What if he decides I'm being selfish and cuts me out of his life? The fear I'd been carrying for days finally found words. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. Then you'll know exactly what kind of son you raised, won't you? A man who loves conditionally, who sees his mother as valuable only when she's giving him what he wants. Is that really the relationship you want to preserve by sacrificing everything you've built? I spent the rest of that afternoon walking through my neighborhood, the same streets I'd traveled thousands of times over the years, past the corner market, where Ms. Rodriguez always saved the best produce for me, and asked about Marcus's career, past the library where I'd taken Marcus for story time when he was small and where I still volunteered once a week, past the small park where I'd pushed him on swings and later watched him play pickup basketball with neighborhood kids. This wasn't just my apartment that Marcus was asking me to abandon, it was my entire community, my support network, my established life. Moving wouldn't just mean giving up my physical space, it would mean starting over completely at an age when most people were settling deeper into their familiar routines and relationships. That evening I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out a legal pad and started making lists. Not the kind of grocery or to-do lists that usually filled my notebooks, but a comprehensive inventory of what Marcus's request would actually cost me, both financially and personally. The financial costs were staggering once I wrote them all down. Moving expenses, security deposits, higher rent, the loss of my current below-market lease, the cost of replacing furniture that wouldn't fit in a smaller space. Even if I found a modest one-bedroom apartment, my monthly expenses would nearly double, forcing me to dip into the small retirement fund I'd been carefully building for years. The personal costs were even more devastating. Loss of my established community, my familiar spaces, my independence, my sense of home and belonging. The message it would send to other family members that I was now available to be displaced whenever my presence became inconvenient. The precedent it would set, that my needs and wants were less important than those of younger family members. But as I wrote, I also began listing something else. The cost to Marcus and Vivian of getting what they wanted without earning, the lesson it would teach them about entitlement and family relationships, the way it would confirm their apparent belief that love meant taking rather than giving, the damage it would do to Marcus's character to know he'd made his mother homeless for his own convenience. By the time I finished writing, I had filled 6 pages with small, careful handwriting, and somewhere in that process, my perspective had shifted completely. This wasn't really about the apartment anymore. It was about what kind of person I was going to be in the final chapters of my life, and what kind of legacy I was going to leave behind. I wasn't going to be the woman who taught her son that love meant self-erasure. I wasn't going to be the mother who enabled her adult child's entitlement by sacrificing her own security. I wasn't going to spend my remaining years in some cramped apartment, struggling financially, so that Marcus and Vivian could have an easier time furnishing their social ambition. The decision, once I made it clearly, brought an unexpected sense of peace. I wasn't angry anymore, or hurt, or desperately seeking a compromise that would somehow make everyone happy. I was simply clear about what was acceptable, and what wasn't, and I was prepared to enforce those boundaries regardless of the consequences. Marcus called the next evening, his voice carefully casual as he asked how I was processing everything. I could hear Vivian in the background, probably coaching him on what to say, how much pressure to apply, how to frame their request as the reasonable solution it clearly wasn't. "I've given your proposal a lot of thought," I told him, settling into my favorite chair with a calmness that surprised even me, "and I've reached a decision." "Great, Mom. I knew you'd see the sense in it once you really considered all the angles. Vivian's already started putting together some ideas for helping you find the perfect place. There's this lovely senior community about 20 minutes from here that has a waiting list, but Vivian knows someone who might be able to help you get in fast." The casual assumption that I'd agreed to their plan, the mention of Vivian already making arrangements for my displacement, the complete absence of any concern for my feelings or preferences, it all crystallized into something hard and bright and absolutely unshakable in my chest. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I'm not moving." There was a long pause, What do you mean you're not moving? We talked about this, we explained why this would be better for everyone. You explained why it would be better for you and Viv. You never asked what would be better for me, or what I wanted, or how this would affect my life. You simply announced that you'd decided my home would serve your purposes better than it serves mine. Mom, that's not fair. We're trying to find a solution that works for the whole family. No, Marcus, you're trying to find a way to get what you want without having to work for it or pay for it yourselves. There's a difference. I could hear him breathing, probably struggling to find the right words to convince me I was being unreasonable. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something harder, more manipulative. I'm disappointed in you, Mom. I really thought you'd want to help us build our future together. I thought family meant something to you. The guilt trip was so transparent, so calculated, that it actually made me smile. Family does mean something to me, Marcus. That's why I spent 30 years working to provide for you, saving for your education, sacrificing my own wants so you could have opportunity. That's why I welcomed Vivian into our family, even when she made it clear she didn't think much of my lifestyle or my choices. That's why I've continued to be available whenever you needed anything, even as you've gradually distanced yourselves from me. We haven't distanced ourselves, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Haven't you? When's the last time you called just to talk, not because you wanted something? When's the last time you asked about my life, my interests, my feelings about anything? When's the last time you spent an evening here without measuring furniture, or discussing how much better the space could be used? He was quiet, probably realizing that he couldn't answer those questions in a way that didn't prove my point. The fact is, I continued, you've already decided I don't matter very much in your lives. You've treated me like a convenience, someone who exists to provide services and support without requiring much attention or consideration in return. The only reason you're talking to me now is because you want something from me, and when I don't give it to you, you're trying to make me feel guilty for putting my own needs first for one. That's not true. Vivian's voice came through the phone, apparently close enough to hear our conversation. We care about you. We just think you're being stubborn about something that could benefit everyone. I felt a flash of anger at her presumption, inserting herself into a conversation between my son and me, offering her opinion on my choices as if she had any right to judge them. Vivian, I said calmly, you've made it clear from the beginning that you consider my lifestyle and my belongings outdated and inappropriate. You've never shown any genuine interest in knowing me as a person, rather than as an obstacle to your decorating plan. You've never asked about my history, my interests, or my feelings about anything, so forgive me if I don't particularly value your opinion on what would benefit me. There was a shocked silence, and I realized I'd finally said what I should have said months ago. I'd finally refused to pretend that Vivian's polite dismissiveness was acceptable, that her thinly veiled condescension was something I needed to tolerate for the sake of family harmony. Marcus's voice when it came back was tight with an anger he was trying to control. Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. We're trying to work with you here, but you're acting like we're asking for something terrible instead of offering you a chance to simplify your life. You're not offering me anything, Marcus. You're demanding that I give up my home so you can have it. There's nothing in this arrangement that benefits me in any way. I lose my security, my community, my independence, and my financial stability, so that you and Vivian can avoid paying market rent for the space you want. We said we'd help you find something else, Vivian interjected. You said you'd help me find something you consider appropriate for someone my age, something smaller, more isolated, more manageable, which is another way of saying less comfortable, less convenient, and less expensive, because it would be worth less. You want to trade down my living situation, so you can trade up yours. I could hear them whispering to each other, probably strategizing their next approach. When Marcus came back on the line, his voice had taken on a cold formality that I'd never heard before. Fine, Mom. If that's really how you feel, then I guess we know where we stand. I just hope you'll remember this conversation when you're sitting alone in that apartment, wondering why your family doesn't visit anymore. The threat was so naked, so cruel that it took my breath away. But it also clarified everything I needed to know about who my son had become, and what my role in his life really was. Marcus, I said softly, if the only reason you visit me is because you hope to get something from me, then you're not really visiting me at all, you're just conducting business. And if your love is conditional on my willingness to sacrifice my security for your convenience, then it was never really love to begin with. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking not with fear or sadness, but with a strange kind of relief. The conversation I'd been dreading had finally happened, and I'd discovered something important about myself. I was stronger than I'd thought, I was clearer about my values than I'd realized, and I was absolutely unwilling to purchase my son's approval at the cost of my own dignity and security. The next few days passed quietly. Marcus didn't call, and neither did I. I went about my normal routines with a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in months, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. I tended my plants, read my books, had coffee with Miss Patterson, and began to remember what it felt like to live without constantly second-guessing my own worth. But I also began to prepare for what I suspected was coming next. I called my attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Morrison, who'd handled my will and a few other legal matters over the years. I explained the situation with Marcus and Vivian, their pressure for me to move, and the threats about family visits that had ended our last conversation. Norma Jean, Rebecca said after I'd finished describing everything, what you're dealing with is more common than you might think. It's a form of elder manipulation that often happens within families, where adult children pressure aging parents to make financial or housing decisions that benefit the children at the expense of the parents' security. But what can I actually do about it?
I mean, they can't force me to move, can they? Legally, no. Your lease is in your name, you're current on rent, and you have tenant rights that protect you from eviction without cause. But there are other forms of pressure they might apply: financial manipulation, emotional blackmail, social isolation. We should make sure all your legal documents are in order, and that you have clear records of these conversations in case the situation escalates. We spent an hour reviewing my will, my financial accounts, and my tenant rights. Rebecca suggested I start keeping a detailed record of any future contacts with Marcus and Vivian, documenting their requests and any threats or manipulation attempts. She also recommended I consider updating my emergency contacts and medical directives to include people who would prioritize my wishes rather than their own convenience. One more thing, she said as I was preparing to leave. You mentioned that your son has a key to your apartment. You might want to consider changing your locks. People who feel entitled to your space sometimes feel entitled to access it, whether you've given permission or not. That afternoon, I called a locksmith. By evening, my apartment had new locks and Marcus no longer had the ability to let himself in whenever he pleased. It was a small change, but it felt symbolically important. My home was truly mine again, protected from intrusion even by people who claimed to love me. I also made another decision that surprised me with its clarity. I called the women's shelter where I'd been volunteering once a week for the past 3 years, reading to children while their mothers attended support groups or met with counselors. I asked if they could use more help, maybe someone willing to commit to additional hours, or take on new responsibilities. Actually, Norma Jean, we've been hoping to expand our literacy program, said Carmen, the director. We could really use someone to coordinate reading activities, and maybe help some of the women work on basic computer skills. Would you be interested in something like that? I found myself saying yes without hesitation. If Marcus and Vivian were determined to isolate me from their lives, I would invest my emotional energy elsewhere, in people who valued what I had to offer, rather than resenting what I wouldn't give up. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my son was threatening to withdraw his visits because I wouldn't sacrifice my home for his convenience, I was deepening my connections with a community of women who understood struggle and sacrifice from the other side. They knew what it meant to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. They understood the value of security and independence in ways that Marcus and Vivian, with their sense of entitlement and their comfortable assumptions, never would. 2 weeks passed without contact from Marcus or Vivian. At first, I found myself checking my phone frequently, expecting the anger to cool and the manipulation to resume in a more subtle form. But as the days went by, I began to appreciate the peace that came with their absence.
No more tension-filled visits where I felt judged and found wanted. No more careful conversations where I tried to say the right thing to maintain a relationship that had apparently been hanging by the thread of my usefulness. I was arranging flowers from my small garden when the doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon. Through the peephole I could see a woman I didn't recognize, well-dressed and official-looking, holding a clipboard and what appeared to be legal documents. "Ms. Watson? I'm Sarah Collins from the Department of Aging and Adult Services. We received a call expressing concern about your living situation and your ability to maintain your current housing arrangements safely." My heart began to pound as I realized what was happening. Someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, had reported me as a vulnerable elder, possibly unable to care for myself properly. It was a calculated move designed to create official pressure for me to relocate, to make my independence seem like a liability rather than a choice. "Who made this report?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The caller identified himself as your son, Marcus Watson. He expressed concern that you're isolated, struggling to maintain your apartment, and possibly not making good decisions about your living situation due to age-related cognitive changes. I invited Ms. Collins in, my mind racing as I tried to understand the full implications of what Marcus had done. He'd essentially reported me to the authorities as incompetent, hoping that official intervention would accomplish what his emotional manipulation had failed to achieve. Ms. Collins was professional but thorough, asking questions about my daily routines, my health, my finances, my social connections. She examined my apartment for safety hazards, checked my refrigerator for adequate food, looked for signs of neglect or inability to maintain basic living standards. I answered every question honestly, provided documentation of my financial stability and medical care, and gave her contact information for Mrs. Patterson and my doctor. "Watson," she said after completing her assessment, "I have to tell you, this is one of the most obviously false reports I've ever investigated. Your apartment is immaculate, you're clearly articulate, and cognitively sharp. Your finances are well managed, and you have strong community connection. There's absolutely no indication that you need intervention or assistance with your living situation. So what happens now?" I asked. "I'll file a report indicating that the concerns were unfounded and that no further action is needed. But I have to ask, do you have any idea why your son might have made this report? Because filing false reports about elder abuse or neglect is actually a form of abuse itself." I explained the situation with the apartment, Marcus's pressure for me to move, and the threats that had followed my refusal. Miss Collins listened with growing concern, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "Watson, what you're describing is a clear pattern of family financial abuse and manipulation. Your son is attempting to use official channels to pressure you into making housing decisions that benefit him at your expense. This is actually a crime in many jurisdictions." She left me with resources about elder rights and abuse prevention, as well as her direct contact information in case Marcus escalated his pressure campaign. But more importantly, she left me with official documentation that I was completely competent to make my own housing decisions, and that anyone attempting to override those decisions was engaging in elder abuse. That evening, I called Marcus for the first time since our last argument. When he answered, his voice was coldly polite, as if he were speaking to a stranger rather than his mother. "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly. "I had an interesting visit today from the Department of Aging and Adult Services. They were responding to a report you made, expressing concern about my ability to live independently." There was a long pause before he responded. "Mom, I was worried about you. You're not thinking clearly about your situation, and I thought maybe some professional input would help you see reason." "What I see clearly," I said, "is that when emotional manipulation didn't work, you decided to try official manipulation. You reported me as incompetent and unsafe, hoping that government intervention would force me to move out of my apartment." "That's not what I was trying to do," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Marcus, the investigator told me that filing false reports about elder abuse is itself a form of elder abuse. You've now crossed a line from pressuring me to actively trying to harm me through official channel." "I'm not trying to harm you. I'm trying to help you make a good decision." "No, You're trying to force me to make the decision you want by any means necessary. First emotional blackmail, then threats to cut off contact, now false reports to government agencies. This isn't love, Marcus. This isn't family support. This is abuse. I could hear him breathing hard, probably struggling with anger and the realization that his tactics weren't working. Fine, Mom. You want to be stubborn and live alone in that big apartment while your family struggles to find adequate housing. You do that, but don't expect us to keep pretending we don't see how selfish you're being. I expect you to stop pretending that your want is my obligation, I replied. I expect you to stop using our relationship as leverage to get what you want, and I expect you to understand that if you contact any official agencies about me again without legitimate cause, I'll file charges for elder abuse and harassment. I hung up feeling drained, but also strangely empowered. I'd finally said everything I should have said months ago. I'd finally refused to accept unacceptable behavior, regardless of who it came from. I'd finally stood up for myself completely, without qualification or apology. The next morning brought another surprise. Mrs. Chen called, her voice tight with anger and concern. Norma Jean, I need to talk to you about something disturbing. I received a call yesterday from someone claiming to be your son, asking about the terms of your lease and whether I'd be willing to discuss alternative arrangements. He seemed to think you were planning to move and wanted to know about the possibility of transferring the lease to him. My stomach dropped. What exactly did he say? He was very smooth about it. Very charming. Said you were thinking of downsizing but were worried about breaking the lease, and he wondered if I might consider allowing him to take over the rental agreement to help the family avoid financial penalty. He made it sound like this was something you wanted but were too embarrassed to ask about directly. The manipulative sophistication of it took my breath away. Marcus was now going around me entirely, trying to convince my landlord that I wanted to move but was too proud or confused to handle the arrangements myself. He was presenting himself as the helpful son managing his aging mother's affairs, when, in reality, he was attempting to steal my housing through deception. Mrs. Chen, I want to be absolutely clear. I have no intention of moving. I have not asked Marcus to make any arrangements on my behalf. Any communications he has with you about my lease or my housing situation are unauthorized and fraudulent. I thought as much, she said grimly. Something about his approach felt wrong, too eager, too presumptuous. I told him that any changes to the lease would have to be discussed directly with you, and that I wasn't comfortable making arrangements through third parties. We talked for another few minutes about protecting my tenancy from further interference. Ms. Chen agreed to document Marcus's unauthorized contact and to refuse any future communications from him about my lease. She also mentioned that she'd been considering raising the rents on the other units in the building, but that my long-term tenancy and excellent record meant she had no intention of pressuring me to leave. Besides, she added, I'd much rather have a reliable tenant like you than deal with the uncertainty of new renters, even at higher rates. Some things are more valuable than maximum profit. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling a mixture of fury and determination. Marcus wasn't just pressuring me anymore. He was actively working to undermine my housing security through deception and manipulation. He was going behind my back to try to arrange my displacement without my knowledge or consent. It was time to take more decisive action. I called Rebecca Morrison again and explained the latest developments. Her response was immediate and clear. Norma Jean, what your son is doing has now crossed into criminal territory. Attempting to manipulate your lease through false representations to your landlord could constitute fraud. Filing false reports with government agencies is abuse. This has gone far beyond family disagreement into active harassment and potential criminal behavior. What are my options? Several. We can send him a cease and desist letter, making it clear that any further interference with your housing, your finances, or your legal affairs will result in criminal charges. We can file for a restraining order if his behavior continues, and we can make sure all your important relationships and institutions know that he has no authority to act on your behalf. I want to do all of that, I said without hesitation. I want him to understand that his behavior has consequences, and I want to protect myself from further manipulation. There's one more thing we should consider, Rebecca said carefully. your will. If Marcus is willing to engage in this kind of behavior to get your apartment, he might have similar expectations about your other assets. You might want to review your estate planning to ensure it reflects your current feelings about his behavior and his character. I had left everything to Marcus in my original will, written years ago when I still believed he would always be the loving son who valued family above personal gain. But that man had apparently been replaced by someone willing to lie to government agencies and defraud landlords to get what he wanted from his mother. Let's schedule a time to review everything, I said. I think it's time I made some changes that reflect reality rather than hope. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Marcus's escalating behavior had actually done me a favor. It had forced me to stop making excuses for him, stop hoping he'd return to the son I thought I'd raised, stop sacrificing my own well-being for someone who clearly didn't value it. His actions had burned bridges I might have spent years trying to rebuild, freeing me to focus on protecting myself and building relationships with people who actually cared about my welfare. The war he'd started was about to get much more serious, but this time I was fighting back with weapons he'd never expected his quiet, accommodating mother to possess. Legal weapons, financial weapons, and most importantly, the weapon of absolute clarity about who he really was and what our relationship actually meant to him. He wanted my apartment badly enough to lie, manipulate, and abuse. Now he was going to learn what it cost to treat family that way. The cease and desist letter arrived at Marcus's office on a Thursday morning, delivered by a legal courier who required his signature. Rebecca had crafted it with surgical precision, documenting every instance of harassment, manipulation, and fraud attempt, while making it clear that any further interference with my housing or personal affairs would result in immediate criminal charges. I didn't call to warn him it was coming. I didn't soften the blow with explanations or apologies. I simply let him discover in the middle of his workday that his quiet, accommodating mother had transformed into someone with sharp legal teeth and the willingness to use them. The call came 3 hours later, his voice shaking with what sounded like equal parts rage and disbelief. "Mom, what the hell is this? A legal letter? You're threatening to have me arrested for trying to help you." "Marcus," I said calmly, "I'm documenting your attempts to file false reports about my competency, your unauthorized contacts with my landlord, and your ongoing campaign to pressure me into giving up my home through harassment and manipulation. That's not help, that's abuse. I can't believe you're doing this. I'm your son, I would never hurt you. You've already hurt me. You've lied to government agencies about my mental state. You've attempted to fraudulently arrange my housing without my consent. You've threatened to cut off family contact unless I comply with your demands. Those are all forms of harm, Marcus. The fact that you can't see that doesn't make them less real." There was a long silence before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had taken on a wheedling, desperate quality that I'd never heard before. "Mom, please, let's just forget about all this legal stuff and talk like family. Vivian and I really need this apartment. We're drowning in rent costs, and our current place is so small we can barely breathe. We thought you'd understand. You know, we thought you'd want to help us get ahead in life." The manipulation was so transparent, so practiced, that I almost laughed. He was trying to reframe his attempted theft of my home as a favor I should be grateful to provide, an opportunity to demonstrate my love through self-sacrifice. "Marcus, you and Vivian are both college-educated adults with good jobs. If you can't afford the rent you want, you find a place you can afford. You don't steal your mother's housing and then call it family loyalty. We're not stealing anything. We're asking for help from someone who has more than she needs. I have exactly what I need, which is secure housing I can afford. You want more than you can afford, which is my apartment at my below-market rent. There's a difference between need and want, and there's a difference between family support and family exploitation." I could hear Vivian's voice in the background, probably coaching him on what to say next. When he came back on the line, his tone had shifted to something colder, more calculated. "Fine, Mom. If that's how you want to play this, then maybe it's time you understood some things about your situation. You're 65 years old, living alone in an apartment that's too big for you, with no one to help if something happened. Maybe having us close by would actually be good for you, not just for us. Are you threatening me, Marcus? I'm pointing out reality. What happens when you fall and can't get up? What happens when you start forgetting things, or can't manage your finances anymore? What happens when you really do need help and you've alienated the only family you have? The threat was clear enough. If I didn't voluntarily give up my independence now, he'd find ways to take it from me later when I was more vulnerable. It was a promise that he'd be watching, waiting, ready to declare me incompetent the moment I showed any signs of aging or frailty. Marcus, I said quietly, what you just described isn't love or family concern. It's a threat to exploit my future vulnerabilities, unless I comply with your current demands. You're essentially promising to abuse me when I'm weaker if I don't submit to abuse now. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. And thank you for being so clear about it, because now I know exactly what kind of son you've become and what I need to protect myself from. I hung up and immediately called Rebecca to add this new threat to our documentation. She listened with growing concern as I recounted the conversation, particularly Marcus's implications about my future vulnerability. Norma Jean, what he just did is called anticipatory abuse, she said grimly. He's threatening to exploit your future incapacity unless you comply with his current demands. This actually strengthens our case significantly, because it shows a pattern of manipulative behavior that's likely to escalate over time. What can we do about it? Several things. First, we're going to create ironclad advance directives that make it clear you're mentally competent now and that any future attempts to override your decisions should be viewed with extreme suspicion. Second, we're going to establish a network of witnesses to your current competency, doctors, neighbors, friends, who can testify to your mental clarity if needed. Third, we're going to make sure all your financial and legal affairs are protected from interference. We spent the next 2 hours creating what Rebecca called a fortress of protection around my independence. New advance directives that specifically named people other than Marcus as my healthcare proxies and decision makers. Updated financial powers of attorney that excluded him entirely. Detailed competency assessment from my doctor. Letters from Mrs. Patterson, my volunteer coordinator at the women's shelter, and my landlord, all attesting to my mental sharpness and independence. The beauty of doing this now, Rebecca explained, is that if he ever tries to challenge your competency in the future, we can point to this comprehensive documentation of your current mental state and your deliberate, well-reasoned decisions to exclude him from authority over your affair. That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called my sister Janet, who lived in Colorado and whom I'd spoken to only sporadically over the past few years. We'd grown apart somewhat after our mother's death, not from any conflict but simply from the natural drift that sometimes happens between siblings leading separate lives. Norma Jean, is everything all right? You never call this. Janet's voice was warm but concerned, and I realized I'd never called her just to talk, only for holiday greetings or family news. I found myself telling her everything. Marcus's demands for my apartment, the escalating harassment, the legal threats, his promises to exploit my future vulnerability. Janet listened with growing outrage, occasionally making sounds of disgust or disbelief. Jesus, Norma Jean, that's horrible. I can't believe Marcus would treat you like that. What kind of man tries to steal his mother's home? The kind of man I apparently raised, I said sadly. No, you didn't raise that kind of man. You raised a decent kid, who somehow turned into an entitled adult. There's a difference. She paused, considering. You know what, I'm coming to visit. I want to see this apartment they're so desperate to steal, and I want to remind Marcus that you have family who actually gives a damn about your welfare. Janet arrived the following weekend, renting a car at the airport and driving straight to my apartment with the kind of determined energy I remembered from our childhood. She was 3 years younger than me but had always been the fiercer one, the sister who never hesitated to fight back when someone tried to take advantage of either of us. She walked through my apartment with the eye of someone evaluating it honestly, rather than looking for flaws or opportunity. This is beautiful, Norma Jean. You've created something really special here. Anyone who would ask you to give this up for their convenience is either crazy or incredibly selfish. Over dinner we talked about our childhood, our mother's final years, the choices we'd made as adults. Janet had never married, focusing instead on her career as a social worker and her network of close friendships. She'd always been more skeptical of traditional family obligations than I was, more willing to set boundaries with people who took advantage of relationship dynamics. The thing is,
she said over coffee and the apple pie I'd made that afternoon. What Marcus is doing isn't actually unusual. I see it all the time in my work. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' resources, who use emotional manipulation and family obligations to justify what amounts to financial abuse. The sad part is how often it works, how many elderly people give up their security because they're afraid of losing relationships that are already gone. What do you mean, already gone? Norma Jean, when was the last time Marcus visited you just because he enjoyed your company? When was the last time he called to ask how you were feeling, or what you were thinking about? When was the last time he treated you like a person he genuinely cared about rather than a resource he could access when needed?
I tried to remember but couldn't come up with a single example from the past 2 years. Every contact had been transactional in some way, either asking for something or setting up situations where they could evaluate my living situation for their own purposes. He's already withdrawn his genuine affection and respect, Janet continued. He's already reduced your relationship to what you can provide rather than who you are. The threats about cutting off contact aren't really threats, because meaningful contact is already gone. He's just making explicit what's already true. The insight hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel but because it was accurate. I'd been fighting to preserve a relationship that had already ended, trying to meet demands designed to extract resources from me while giving nothing meaningful in return. So what do? You stop negotiating with someone who's already decided you don't matter. You stop trying to preserve a connection that exists only when he wants something. You start building relationships with people who value you for who you are, not what you can give them. Janet stayed for 5 days, and during that time I saw my life through different eyes. She accompanied me to my volunteer work at the women's shelter, where she watched me coordinate reading programs and help women practice computer skills. She met Mrs. Patterson and several other neighbors, all of whom clearly valued my friendship and company. She attended a book club meeting with me, where I was treated as an integral part of the group rather than a tolerated presence. "You have a whole life here," she said on her last evening. "A community, meaningful work, friendships, activities you enjoy. Why would you give all this up to become isolated and financially stressed so that Marcus can have easier access to real estate? He hasn't earned." She also met with Rebecca while she was in town, adding her voice to the growing documentation of my competency and the reasonableness of my decision. As Norma Jean's sister, she told the lawyer, I wanted on record that I fully support her choices about her housing and her financial affairs. Any future attempts to override her decisions should be viewed as abuse rather than family concern. Before Janet left, she did something that surprised me. She called Marcus. "Marcus, this is your Aunt Janet. I'm in town visiting your mother, and I wanted to talk to you about the situation with her apartment." I could only hear one side of the conversation, but Janet's responses told me everything I needed to know about Marcus's attitude. "No, I don't think she's being unreasonable. I think you're being entitled. Marcus, she worked for decades to afford that apartment. Why should she give it up so you can avoid paying market rent? That's not family loyalty, that's family exploitation. Actually, I think she's making an excellent decision to protect her independence from someone who's trying to manipulate her into giving up her security." The conversation ended with Janet hanging up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "He's worse than I thought," she said. "He actually tried to convince me that you're having cognitive problems, and that taking over your apartment would be doing you a favor. He seems to genuinely believe that wanting to keep your own home is evidence of mental decline." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that trying to steal your mother's housing is evidence of moral decline, and that if he contacts any more government agencies or landlords about you, he'll be hearing from me as well as your lawyer." After Janet left, I felt stronger and clearer than I had in months. Her visit had reminded me that I wasn't actually isolated, that I had people in my life who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. It had also shown me how distorted my perspective had become from months of Marcus's manipulation. How I'd started to doubt my own judgment and question my right to make decisions about my own life. But Marcus wasn't finished. A few days after Janet's departure, I received a call from someone who identified herself as Vivian's mother, a woman named Patricia, whom I'd met only briefly at their wedding. "Norma Jean, I hope you don't mind me calling, but Vivian has been so upset about this situation with the apartment, and I thought maybe we could find a way to work things out that would make everyone happy. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the reaction I'd learned to recognize as manipulation approaching. What kind of solution did you have in mind, Patricia? Well, I know you're attached to your current place, but have you considered that there might be some advantages to downsize? I have a friend who manages a lovely senior community just outside the city. Very social, lots of activities, much less maintenance responsibility. I could arrange for you to visit, see if it might actually be an improvement over your current situation. The approach was smoother than Marcus's direct demands, but the goal was identical. Patricia was trying to convince me that giving up my home would actually benefit me, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to be displaced for my son's convenience. Patricia, I'm perfectly happy with my current living situation. I'm not looking to move, and I'm not interested in senior communities. I have a home that suits my needs exactly. Of course, dear, but sometimes we don't realize how isolated we've become until we experience alternatives. This community has people your age, planned activities, group meals. It might be exactly what you need to stay socially engaged. I'm already socially engaged. I have friends, volunteer work, community connections and activities I enjoy. I don't need to move to a senior community to have a social life. There was a pause, and when Patricia spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly, becoming more direct. Norma Jean, I'm going to be honest with you. Marcus and Vivian are struggling financially. Their current rent is eating up most of their income, and they're having trouble saving for their future. Your apartment would solve their problems and free up money they could use for other important things, like starting a family. And there it was, the real pressure point they thought would work where others had failed. The promise of grandchildren, dangled like a carrot to convince me that sacrificing my security was the key to achieving the family life I'd supposedly been hoping for. Patricia, if Marcus and Vivian want to start a family, they should focus on building financial stability through their own efforts, not by taking housing away from a family member. My apartment won't solve their money problems, it will just transfer those problems to me. But you don't need as much space as they do. You're just one person, and they're planning for a growing family. I need exactly as much space as I choose to live in. The fact that they want more space than they can afford doesn't create an obligation for me to have less space than I want. Patricia was quiet for a moment, probably realizing that her approach wasn't working any better than Marcus's direct demands, or Vivian's design fantasies. I think you're being very selfish, she said finally, her polite facade dropping away entirely. Family is supposed to help each other, and here you are, hoarding space and resources while young people struggle to get ahead in life. Patricia, I worked for 40 years to afford my housing. Marcus and Vivian are perfectly capable of working for theirs. The fact that they'd prefer to take mine rather than earn doesn't make me selfish for refusing to be victimized. I hung up feeling a mixture of anger and clarity. Now I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just Marcus and Vivian pressuring me. They'd recruited her family to help manipulate me, probably presenting my refusal to give up my home as unreasonable selfishness rather than reasonable self-protection. But the conversation had also revealed something important. They were struggling financially, which explained the desperation behind their increasingly aggressive tactics. They weren't just coveting my apartment because it was nice, they needed it because they'd overextended themselves and couldn't afford to live the way they wanted on their current income. That evening, I made a decision that felt both generous and strategic. I called a real estate agent I'd met through my volunteer work, a woman named Carol who specialized in helping people find affordable housing. Carol, I have an unusual request. I'm looking for apartment listings for a young couple with good jobs but limited savings, something in their current price range, but nicer than what they can typically afford with those financial constraints. Carol was intrigued by the challenge and promised to send me listings within a few days. When they arrived, I printed out information for 6 different apartments, all in nice neighborhoods, all within what Marcus and Vivian should be able to afford based on their stated incomes, all available for immediate occupancy. I mailed the listings to them with a brief note. Since you're having trouble finding appropriate housing in your price range, I thought these options might interest you. All are available now and should be affordable on your current income. Best wishes for your housing search, Norma. It was my final attempt to provide actual help rather than simply resisting their demands. If they were genuinely struggling to find housing they could afford, these listings would solve their problem without requiring anyone to sacrifice their security. If they ignored the listings and continued pressuring me for my apartment, I'd know their real motivation wasn't need, but greed. Marcus called 2 days after receiving the listings, his voice tight with anger. What is this supposed to be, Mom? Some kind of joke? It's a list of apartments you can actually afford since you told me you were having financial difficulties. I thought you'd appreciate help finding a realistic solution to your housing needs. We don't want just any apartment. We want character, architectural details, space for entertainment. These are all generic modern places with no personality. They're apartments you can afford without stealing housing from your mother. They're what normal people call solutions. We're not normal people, Mom. We have standards, expectations for our lifestyle. We need something that reflects who we are and where we're going in life. Then you need to earn enough money to afford those standards rather than expecting me to subsidize them with my housing. God, you're impossible. We offer you a chance to simplify your life, and you act like we're trying to rob you. We try to find compromise solutions, and you send us listings for apartments that are completely beneath what we need. The entitlement in his voice was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that his preferences and aspirations created obligations for me, that his desire for a certain lifestyle gave him the right to take my resources to achieve it. Marcus, what you need and what you want are two different things. You need housing you can afford. You want housing you can't afford. The difference between those two things is not my responsibility. Fine, Mom. You've made your choice. Don't come crying to us when you realize what you've lost. For the third time in our recent conversations, he hung up on me with threats and ultimatum. But this time, I felt nothing but relief. I'd offered genuine help, a real solution to their stated problem, and they'd rejected it because it didn't give them everything they wanted at someone else's expense. Any remaining doubt about their motivations was gone. This had never been about need or financial difficulty. It had always been about getting something valuable without paying for it, about taking advantage of family relationships to acquire resources they couldn't otherwise afford. I called Rebecca to add this latest interaction to our growing file of documentation. She listened with what sounded like professional satisfaction as I described their rejection of affordable alternatives in favor of continued pressure for my apartment. This is perfect, Norma. It shows that they're not actually struggling to find housing. They're specifically targeting your housing because it's underpriced and desirable. It completely undermines any future claims that their behavior was motivated by genuine need, rather than opportunistic greed. What happens now? Now we wait. They've exhausted their obvious pressure tactics, and you've demonstrated that you're not going to be manipulated or intimidated. They have 3 choices: accept that they can't have your apartment, and find their own housing, escalate to more serious harassment that will result in criminal charges, or give up and move on with their lives. Which do you think they'll choose? Based on the pattern so far, I suspect they'll try one more major escalation before they accept defeat. People this entitled don't usually give up without a final attempt to get what they want through whatever means necessary. Rebecca was right, but when the final escalation came, it was more vicious and desperate than even I had expected, and it targeted the one part of my life I'd thought was completely protected from their interference. The attack came through my volunteer work at the women's shelter, where I'd been spending more and more time as my relationship with Marcus deteriorated. Carmen, the director, called me on a Thursday morning, her voice tight with concern and confusion. Norma Jean, I need to talk to you about something disturbing. We received a call yesterday from someone claiming to be your son, expressing concerns about your volunteer work here. My heart sank as I realized what Marcus had done. Unable to manipulate my housing situation, my finances, or my legal status, he'd turned his attention to undermining my volunteer work, one of the few sources of joy and purpose I'd found outside my relationship with him. What kind of concern? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be devastating. He claimed that you've been exhibiting signs of confusion and inappropriate behavior with our client. He said family members have noticed memory problems and poor judgment, and he was worried that you might not be safe to work with vulnerable women and children. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Marcus was now trying to destroy my relationships with people who depended on me, attacking my reputation in a community where trust and reliability were essential. He was willing to harm vulnerable women and children by depriving them of services, just to pressure me into giving up my apartment. Carmen, everything he told you is a lie. I'm not exhibiting confusion or memory problems. I'm not behaving inappropriately. He's harassing me because I won't give up my apartment for him and his wife, and now he's trying to isolate me from my volunteer work as another pressure tactic. I hoped that's what this was, Carmen said with relief, because honestly, we've seen no signs of any problems. You're one of our most reliable and effective volunteers, but I had to ask, because we have to take any reports about volunteer behavior serious. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Carmen documenting Marcus's false report and my explanation of his harassment campaign. She assured me that my volunteer status wasn't in jeopardy, but she also warned me that if he continued making false reports, it could create ongoing problems for both me and the organization. I spent the rest of that day in a fury so cold and focused it surprised me. Marcus had now attacked my housing, my independence, my legal status, my family relationships, and my community service. He'd tried to have me declared incompetent, to manipulate my lease, to isolate me from supportive family members, and now to destroy my reputation among people who relied on my help. The time for defensive measures was over. It was time to show Marcus exactly what it meant to cross lines that should never be crossed, to attack someone's entire life because they wouldn't give you what you wanted. I called Rebecca and explained the latest development. Her response was immediate and decisive. We're filing for a restraining order, and we're pursuing charges for harassment and filing false reports. He's now interfering with your employment and volunteer activities through fraudulent claims. This has become a systematic campaign of abuse that needs to be stopped through legal intervention. What will that involve? We'll need to document every instance of harassment, manipulation, and false reporting. We'll present evidence of his attempts to fraudulently interfere with your lease, his false reports to government agencies, and now his attempts to damage your volunteer work. We'll ask for a court order prohibiting any further contact with you or interference with your activities. And if he violates the restraining order, then he goes to jail, which might be exactly what someone this entitled needs to understand, that actions have consequences. That evening, I made one final call. I contacted Marcus's employer, a marketing firm where he'd worked for several years, and apparently enjoyed a good reputation. I asked to speak with the human resources director about a personal matter involving one of their employees. Ms. Watson, I appreciate you calling, but I can't discuss personnel matters or employee issues with outside parties, the HR director said politely. I understand. I'm not asking you to discuss anything with me. I'm calling to inform you that your employee, Marcus Watson, has been engaging in a campaign of harassment against a family member that has now escalated to filing false reports with government agencies and interfering with volunteer work at a women's shelter. I thought you should be aware that he's been using work time to make harassing phone calls and coordinate these activities. There was a long pause. Are you filing legal charges? Yeah, my attorney is preparing a restraining order and pursuing criminal charges for harassment and filing false reports. I wanted you to know because some of this harassment has taken place during business hours, and because his behavior reflects poorly on your company's values. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. We'll look into the matter. I hung up feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I'd spent months trying to preserve my relationship with Marcus, trying to find ways to meet his demands without destroying myself, trying to believe that somewhere inside the man making these threats was the son I'd raised with love and sacrifice. But that son was gone, if he'd ever really existed. The person threatening to destroy my life unless I gave him my home was a stranger wearing my son's face, someone whose sense of entitlement had grown so large, it had consumed any genuine love or respect he might once have felt for me. Tomorrow Rebecca would file papers that would legally recognize what I'd already accepted emotionally. Marcus was no longer my family in any meaningful sense. He was my abuser, and like any abuse victim, I needed legal protection from someone who had shown he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted from me. The war was about to enter its final phase, And this time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was going on the offensive against someone who had forgotten that love flows both ways, that family relationships require mutual respect, and that some prices are too high to pay for anyone's happiness, including your own child. Marcus wanted my apartment badly enough to try to destroy my entire life to get it. Now he was going to learn what it really meant to lose everything that mattered. The restraining order was granted on a gray Monday morning in November, with Judge Margaret Henley listening to 3 hours of testimony about Marcus's escalating harassment campaign. Rebecca had prepared meticulously, presenting a timeline of abuse that started with emotional manipulation and progressed through fraudulent contact with my landlord, false reports to government agencies, and attempts to sabotage my volunteer work. Marcus arrived at court with his own attorney, a nervous-looking young man who seemed unprepared for the mountain of evidence Rebecca had assembled. I watched my son sit at the defendant's table, his face a mask of indignant disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend how his reasonable requests for my apartment had led to a courtroom confrontation. When Judge Henley asked if he understood the charges against him, Marcus stood and addressed the court directly, despite his lawyer's obvious discomfort. "Your Honor, this is all a misunderstanding. I'm trying to help my elderly mother make good decisions about her living situation. She's become increasingly isolated and defensive, and I'm concerned that she's not thinking clearly about what's best for her future." Judge Henley studied him with the kind of steady gaze that had probably seen every form of manipulation attempted in family court. "Mr. Watson, according to the evidence presented, your mother has been evaluated by medical professionals, social workers, and legal counsel, all of whom have found her to be completely competent and mentally sharp. Your concerns about her decision-making seem to coincide remarkably with your desire to obtain her housing." Marcus's face flushed red. "I'm not trying to obtain anything illegally. I'm trying to help my family find appropriate housing, while ensuring my mother gets the care and attention she needs as she ages. By filing false reports about her competency, by attempting to manipulate her lease without her knowledge, by interfering with her volunteer work through fraudulent complaints. Those weren't fraudulent. I have legitimate concerns about her behavior and judgment." Judge Henley leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Watson, every professional who has evaluated your mother's competency has concluded that your concerns are unfounded. Every institution you've contacted about her landlord, social services, her volunteer organization, has reported that your claims don't match their observations of her behavior. At what point do you think we should consider that your concerns might be motivated by something other than genuine care for her welfare?" The question hung in the courtroom air like an accusation. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, probably realizing that any answer would further damage his credibility. Rebecca stood to present her final argument, and I felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness as she systematically dismantled any remaining pretense that Marcus's behavior had been motivated by family concern. "Your Honor, what we have here is a clear pattern of elder abuse disguised as family assistance. Mr. Watson has attempted to use every pressure tactic available to force his mother to give up her housing for his benefit. When emotional manipulation failed, he escalated to fraud. When fraud failed, he escalated to false reports. When false reports failed, he escalated to attempting to destroy her community relationships and volunteer work." She gestured toward the evidence folders stacked on our table. "At no point has Mr. Watson shown genuine concern for his mother's welfare. At no point has he accepted her clearly expressed wishes about her own life. At no point has he offered solutions that would benefit her rather than himself. This is not family concern. This is a systematic campaign of abuse designed to steal housing from an elderly woman, through intimidation and manipulation." Judge Henley granted the restraining order with language that was both comprehensive and severe. Marcus was prohibited from contacting me directly or indirectly, from interfering with my housing arrangements, from making any reports about my competency to government or private agencies, and from contacting my landlord, my volunteer organizations, or any of my friends or associates. The order also included a provision I hadn't expected. Judge Henley ordered Marcus to undergo counseling for elder abuse and family manipulation. with completion of the program required before any consideration of modifying the restraining order. "Miss Watson," she said as she signed the final paperwork, "I want you to understand something clearly. What you have done to your mother constitutes a serious crime in this jurisdiction. You are fortunate that she is seeking protection rather than prosecution, but that generosity should not be mistaken for weakness. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and criminal charge." As we left the courtroom, I caught sight of Marcus standing in the hallway with his lawyer, his face a portrait of stunned disbelief. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something there that might have been recognition, a glimpse of understanding about what he'd done and what it had cost both of us. But the moment passed, and when Vivian appeared at his side, his expression hardened back into the familiar mask of righteous indignation. I heard her voice as they walked away, already strategizing about appeals and alternative approaches, apparently still convinced that they were the victims in this situation. The immediate aftermath of the restraining order brought a peace I hadn't experienced in months. My phone stopped ringing with manipulation disguised as family concern. No more unexpected visits or attempts to measure my furniture, no more false reports to agencies or interference with my volunteer work. The constant state of vigilance I'd been living in gradually relaxed into something approaching normal life, but the emotional aftermath was more complicated. I found myself grieving, not just for the son I'd lost, but for the son I'd apparently never really had. The Marcus who sat in that courtroom, showing no remorse for his attempts to destroy my life, was so far from the child I'd raised, that I had to question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. Miss Patterson, who had accompanied me to court as a character witness, helped me process some of these feelings during our coffee sessions in the weeks that followed. "You're mourning the death of an illusion," she said, one afternoon as we sat in her living room watching November rain streak the windows. "You thought you'd raised a man who valued family relationships based on love and mutual respect. You're discovering that you actually raised someone who sees family as a resource to be exploited when convenient. But how did that happen? Where did I go wrong?" "Maybe you didn't go wrong. Maybe some people are just selfish by nature, and no amount of love and sacrifice can change that fundamental character flaw. Or maybe you loved so unconditionally that he never learned that relationships require reciprocity and respect." I thought about all the times I'd said yes when I should have said no, all the sacrifices I'd made without expecting anything in return, all the boundaries I'd failed to establish because I thought unconditional love meant unlimited availability. "I spent 40 years teaching him that my needs didn't matter as much as his," I said slowly. "Maybe the problem isn't that he changed. Maybe the problem is that he learned exactly what I taught him." The insight was painful but liberating. I'd created the dynamic that made Marcus feel entitled to my resources, that made him assume my role was to facilitate his happiness regardless of the cost to my own well-being. I'd taught him that love meant sacrifice, but only sacrifice flowing in one direction. Understanding this didn't make his behavior acceptable, but it did make it comprehensible.
And more importantly, it helped me understand why rebuilding my life needed to focus on relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. I threw myself into my volunteer work with renewed energy, finding deep satisfaction in relationships where my contributions were valued and reciprocated. The women at the shelter appreciated my help not because they felt entitled to it, but because they understood its value and expressed genuine gratitude. The children I read to brightened when they saw me not because they expected me to meet their every need, but because they enjoyed my company and attention. Carmen noticed the change in my engagement and offered me additional responsibilities, coordinating educational programs and helping women develop job skills. For the first time in years, I felt valued for my abilities and judgment, rather than simply for my willingness to give up what others wanted. "You seem different lately," she observed one afternoon, as we reviewed applications for a new computer literacy program. "More confident, more decisive. Whatever you've been going through, it seems to have made you stronger." I told her about the court case and the restraining order, about finally setting boundaries with someone who had been exploiting my love for years. She listened with the professional understanding of someone who'd seen many women struggle to escape abusive relationships. "It's interesting," she said. "We usually think of elder abuse as something that happens to weak or vulnerable people. But what you've described is abuse of someone strong enough to resist it and fight back.
Your son didn't target you because you were weak. He targeted you because you had something valuable that he wanted. He thought I was weak enough to give it up rather than lose his approval. But you weren't, and now he's learning that there are consequences for treating family members like resources to be exploited. The consequences were indeed significant. Through my attorney, I learned that Marcus's employer had placed him on administrative leave pending an investigation of his workplace harassment activity. Apparently, several coworkers had come forward to report that he'd been making personal calls during work hours and using company resources to research my landlord and coordinate his manipulation campaign. Vivian, meanwhile, had been forced to find new freelance clients after word spread in her professional network about the harassment case. Several of her former clients, particularly those who worked in social services or elder care, had quietly distanced themselves from someone involved in elder abuse allegations. I felt no satisfaction in their professional difficulties, but I did feel a sense of just actions had consequences, and people who chose to abuse family members couldn't expect their behavior to remain private or without cost to their reputations and careers. More importantly, I was building a new life that didn't depend on anyone's approval or inclusion. I'd expanded my volunteer work, deepened my friendships, and discovered interests I'd neglected during the years when most of my emotional energy went toward maintaining a relationship with someone who didn't truly value it. I started taking an art class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for when I was constantly available for Marcus's needs. I joined a hiking group for people over 60, discovering that I was much more physically capable than I'd realized. I even went on a weekend trip to visit Janet in Colorado, my first vacation in over 5 years. You look about 10 years younger, Janet observed as we sat on her back deck watching the sunset over the mountains. Getting rid of toxic people really agrees with you. I feel young. I feel like myself again, instead of like someone's perpetually disappointed mother. What are you going to do about your will? Are you still leaving everything to Marcus? It was a question I'd been avoiding, though I knew it needed to be addressed. My current will still left my apartment, my savings and my personal belongings to someone who had tried to manipulate me out of them while I was alive. I think it's time to make some changes, I said. I want my estate to go to people and organizations that actually value what I've built. When I returned home, I made an appointment with Rebecca to revise my estate planning completely. We created a new will that reflected my current values and relationships rather than my outdated hopes about family loyalty. The majority of my estate now went to the women's shelter, with smaller bequests to Mrs. Patterson, Janet, and several other friends who had shown genuine care for my well-being. I left Marcus a single item, the photo album documenting his childhood, along with a letter explaining that I hoped someday he would remember what it felt like to love someone without expecting them to sacrifice everything for his happiness. It's a powerful statement, Rebecca observed as we finished the paperwork. You're essentially telling him that love and respect have to be earned, not assumed. 6 months after the restraining order was granted, I received an unexpected call from Marcus's attorney. He wanted to arrange a mediated conversation between Marcus and me, with the goal of healing family relationships and finding a path forward that works for everyone. I agreed to the meeting, though not because I had any intention of resuming a relationship with Mark. I was curious to see if the consequences of his behavior had led to any genuine understanding of what he'd done wrong, or if this was simply another manipulation tactic disguised as reconciliation. The mediation took place in a neutral conference room at the family court building, with a professional mediator facilitating the conversation. Marcus arrived looking tired and older, accompanied by his attorney, and what I assumed was a counselor from his court-ordered therapy program. The mediator began by establishing ground rules for respectful communication, then asked Marcus if he had anything he wanted to say to me. He looked directly at me for the first time in months, and I could see something in his expression that might have been genuine remorse. Mom, I want to apologize for how I handled the situation with your apartment. I realize now that some of my approaches were inappropriate, and that I caused you significant distress. It was a careful, lawyer-coached apology that acknowledged wrongdoing without accepting full responsibility. I waited to see if he would say anything more substantive. The counseling has helped me understand that I was trying to control a situation that wasn't mine to control, and that I let my frustration override my respect for your autonomy and decision-making. Better, but still generic and therapeutic rather than personal. I decided to test whether this apparent insight went beyond learned phrases from therapy sessions. Marcus, do you understand why I couldn't give you my apartment? He considered the question carefully. I think I understand now that it wasn't just about the apartment. It was about your independence and your right to make your own choices about your life. And do you understand why your methods of trying to convince me were unacceptable? I crossed boundaries that I shouldn't have crossed. I involved third parties inappropriately and made false reports that damaged your reputation and caused you emotional harm. The words were right, but something about his delivery felt rehearsed rather than heartfelt. I decided to push deep. What would you do differently if you could go back and handle the situation again? I would accept your decision and focus on finding housing solutions that didn't require anyone else to sacrifice their security. Still the right words, but delivered with the mechanical precision of someone reciting learned responses, rather than expressing genuine understanding. The mediator asked if I had anything I wanted to say to Marcus. I'd spent weeks preparing for this possibility, and I knew exactly what needed to be said. Marcus, I appreciate that you've gone through counseling and learned to recognize that your behavior was inappropriate, but I need you to understand that the damage you did goes beyond the harassment and manipulation. You taught me that the son I thought I raised never really existed. His face tightened, and I saw a flash of the old defensiveness before he controlled. For 40 years I believed I had raised a man who valued family relationships based on love and mutual respect. I believed I had a son who would protect my welfare rather than exploit my vulnerability. I believed the sacrifices I made for you had created a bond that would endure through any difficulties. I paused, watching his face carefully for any sign of genuine emotion rather than therapeutic compliance. What I discovered is that you saw those sacrifices as establishing a debt rather than expressing love. You believed that my years of putting your needs first created an obligation for me to continue putting your needs first forever, even when doing so would destroy my own security and well-being. The mediator started to intervene, probably thinking my words were too harsh for productive dialogue, but I held up my hand to continue. The most painful part isn't what you did to try to get my apartment. It's what those actions revealed about how you've always seen our relationship. I was never really your mother to you. I was a resource, a service provider, someone whose value was measured by my willingness to give you what you wanted. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but I wasn't finished. If this mediation is supposed to heal our relationship, then I need to know. Do you love me as a person, or do you love what I've been willing to provide for you? Because if it's the latter, then there's nothing to heal. There's just a transaction that I'm no longer willing to participate. The room was silent for a long moment. The mediator, the attorneys, even Marcus's counselor seemed to recognize that this was a moment of truth that couldn't be managed or mediated away. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quieter and less controlled than it had been during his prepared apology. I don't know how to answer that question, Mom. I've never really thought about the difference. It was the most honest thing he'd said since entering the room, and paradoxically, it gave me more hope than all his therapeutic language about boundaries and autonomy. Then that's what you need to figure out, I said gently. Because until you understand the difference between loving someone and using someone, any relationship we might rebuild would just be another version of the same dynamic that brought us here. I stood to leave, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely peaceful. I'd said what needed to be said, and I'd given Marcus the opportunity to demonstrate whether he'd genuinely changed or simply learned to disguise his manipulation in more socially acceptable language. If you ever figure out how to love someone without expecting them to sacrifice everything for your happiness, I said as I reached the door, you know where to find me. But I won't be waiting around for that to happen, and I won't be available for any more transactions disguised as family relationships. The mediator called after me, asking if I wanted to schedule a follow-up session, but I shook my head. I'd said everything that needed saying, and anything more would just be negotiating with someone who fundamentally didn't understand what there was to negotiate about. As I walked out of the building into the bright spring sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete freedom from the need to manage someone else's emotions or expectations. For the first time since this ordeal began, I wasn't wondering what Marcus would do next, how he would react to my choices, or what I could do to preserve a relationship that had never actually existed in the form I'd imagined. I was simply free to live my own life, make my own choices, and build relationships with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could give them. It had taken 66 years and a courtroom confrontation with my own son to learn that lesson, but as I drove home to my beloved apartment on Maple Street, I realized it was never too late to start living authentically. The apartment welcomed me back with its familiar creaks and light patterns, its carefully chosen furniture and lovingly tended plants. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, exactly as I'd chosen to arrange it, exactly as it should be in a home that belonged completely and unquestionably to the person who lived there. I made myself a cup of tea, settled into my favorite chair by the window, and opened a book I'd been meaning to read. Outside, spring was transforming the neighborhood with new leaves and blooming flowers, and inside, I was finally at peace in the space I'd worked decades to create, and had fought so hard to keep. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for anything or anyone. I was simply present in my own life, grateful for what I'd built and excited about what came next. And if that wasn't victory, it was certainly something very close to it. 2 years passed in blessed quiet. My apartment remained exactly as I'd chosen to arrange it, filled with light and books and the small treasures I'd collected over a lifetime of careful choices. The herbs on my windowsill grew abundant, my volunteer work expanded into program management, and I discovered that life without the constant drain of a toxic relationship was remarkably full and satisfying. I rarely thought about Marcus anymore, except when his absence made some moment particularly peaceful. No more tension headaches from dreading phone calls, no more second-guessing my choices through the lens of someone else's judgment, no more walking on eggshells in my own home, wondering when the next demand would come. Mrs. Patterson and I had developed a comfortable routine of morning coffees and evening walks around the neighborhood. My book club had become a cornerstone of my social life, and I'd even started dating a gentle widower named Frank, who met me through the hiking group. Nothing serious, just the companionship of someone who appreciated my independence, rather than seeing it as an obstacle to his desire. The women's shelter had promoted me to volunteer coordinator, a role that gave me genuine purpose and measurable impact on other people's lives. I helped women transitioning out of abuse situations develop practical skills and confidence, watching them transform from frightened survivors into capable women building new lives on their own terms. There was profound satisfaction in this work, perhaps because my own experience had taught me something valuable about reclaiming power from people who tried to take it away. I understood what it meant to be targeted by someone who saw your resources as their opportunity, who confused love with ownership, who used family relationships as weapons for manipulation. My financial situation had stabilized beautifully. Without the constant pressure to consider giving up my rent-controlled apartment, I'd been able to plan for the future with confidence. I'd opened a separate savings account for home improvements, and was considering finally replacing those kitchen cabinets I'd been putting off for years. The restraining order remained in effect, and Marcus had made no attempts to violate it. Through Janet, who still lived in Colorado but visited twice a year, I learned fragments of information about his life. He and Vivian had eventually found an apartment they could afford, though apparently not without significant downsizing of their social expectations. His job situation had stabilized after a period of professional consequences, but his reputation in their social circle had never fully recovered. I felt no triumph in his difficulties, but I did feel vindicated in my assessment that their housing crisis had been manufactured desperation rather than genuine need. They'd survived just fine without stealing my home, which confirmed that their pressure campaign had been about greed rather than necessity. On a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after the day Marcus first sat in my kitchen and explained why I should move out of my own apartment, I received an unexpected envelope in the mail. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize, and inside was a letter that made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair. The letter informed me that Marcus had been arrested for elder financial abuse in connection with a different case entirely. Apparently he'd been working as a financial advisor for elderly clients, and had been systematically manipulating vulnerable seniors into making investment decisions that benefited him personally while depleting their retirement savings. The pattern was depressingly familiar: emotional manipulation disguised as family-style concern, pressure tactics presented as helpful guidance, financial exploitation justified as being in the victim's best interest. The same techniques he'd tried to use on me, refined and deployed against people who were genuinely vulnerable rather than simply related to him. The letter was from an attorney representing other victims who were building a class action lawsuit. They'd learned about my restraining order through court records and wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about Marcus's methods and patterns of manipulation. I set the letter down and walked to my living room window, looking out at the street where I'd chosen to build my life, the neighborhood I'd refused to abandon when someone else decided it would serve their purposes better than mine. The irony was sharp and sad. Marcus had learned nothing from our confrontation except perhaps how to target more vulnerable victims, but there was also justice in the revelation. His fundamental character hadn't changed after our legal battle. He'd simply found new targets for the same exploitative instincts that had driven him to try to steal my home. Now he was facing consequences from the legal system rather than just from family relationships he'd already destroyed. I called the attorney that afternoon and agreed to participate in their case. My testimony would help establish a pattern of manipulative behavior that extended beyond financial fraud into family abuse. It would demonstrate that Marcus's actions weren't isolated mistakes, but consistent character traits that made him dangerous to any vulnerable person who trusted him. The trial took place the following spring, in the same courthouse where I'd obtained my restraining order 3 years earlier. This time Marcus sat at the defendant's table facing multiple felony charges, surrounded by evidence of systematic fraud that had cost a dozen elderly clients their life savings. When I took the witness stand, I spoke clearly and calmly about the methods he'd used to try to manipulate me into giving up my housing. The emotional pressure disguised as family concern, the false reports to authorities designed to undermine my credibility, the attempts to isolate me from supportive relationships, the escalating threats when other tactics failed, the techniques he used on me, I told the jury, were identical to what these other victims experienced. The only difference was that I had resources and support that allowed me to resist. These elderly clients trusted him as a professional and didn't have family members or attorneys to help them recognize the manipulation. Marcus's defense attorney tried to characterize our family conflict as irrelevant to the financial crimes, but the prosecutor effectively demonstrated that the pattern of exploitation was consistent across both personal and professional relationships. Someone willing to abuse his own mother for financial gain had simply expanded that willingness into criminal enterprise. The jury convicted Marcus on all counts. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims, an amount that would bankrupt him completely even after his release. As I left the courthouse after the sentencing, I felt a complex mixture of emotion: sadness for the son I'd once loved, who had chosen a path that led inevitably to this destruction, relief that he could no longer harm vulnerable people who trusted him, and a deep sense of gratitude that I'd been strong enough to resist his initial attempts at manipulation, that I'd recognized the danger early enough to protect myself and potentially spare others by establishing his pattern of abuse in court records. Miss Patterson was waiting for me in the courthouse lobby, having insisted on accompanying me to provide moral support during my testimony. As we walked to her car, she asked how I was feeling about the verdict. Sad, I said honestly, but not surprised. Someone who would try to steal his mother's home was always going to find other victims eventually. At least now he can't hurt anyone else for a while. Do you think you'll ever forgive him? I considered the question as we drove through the city streets toward home. I think I already have forgiven him, in the sense that I'm not carrying anger about what he did to me anymore, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what someone is capable of, or putting myself at risk by trusting them again. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea and the local newspaper, which had covered the trial in detail. The article included quotes from several of Marcus's victims, elderly people who'd lost their retirement savings to someone they'd trusted as a professional advisor and friend. One woman, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, was quoted as saying, "He seemed so caring at first, so concerned about my financial security. He said his own mother had faced similar challenges with managing her affairs as she aged, and he wanted to make sure I didn't go through the same difficulty. I trusted him because he talked about family and protecting the people you love. The irony was devastating. Marcus had used his supposed concern for my welfare as a selling point to convince other elderly clients to trust him with their finances. He'd turned his abuse of me into a marketing tool for abusing others, claiming expertise in elder care while systematically stealing from the people who believed his lies. But reading about his victims also reinforced my understanding of why I'd been able to resist when others could. I'd had advantages many elderly people lack: a supportive family member in Janet, a trustworthy attorney in Rebecca, friends like Mrs. Patterson, who recognized manipulation when they saw it. I'd also had the financial stability of my rent-controlled apartment, which meant I wasn't desperate enough to consider dangerous alternatives. Most importantly, I'd had experience with Marcus's character that allowed me to recognize when his behavior shifted from annoying to dangerous. These other victims had only seen his public persona, the charming professional who seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare. The newspaper article included information about resources for elderly people who suspected they were being financially exploited, and I clipped it to take to my volunteer work at the women's shelter. Many of the women we served had elderly family members who might be vulnerable to similar schemes. 6 months after Marcus's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison. The envelope had been opened and presumably read by prison officials, and the letter itself was brief and carefully worded. "Dear Mom, I hope this letter finds you well. I've had a lot of time to think about my choices and their consequences. I understand now that I hurt you badly, and that I hurt other people who trusted me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand the difference between loving someone and using someone. I know it's too late to rebuild our relationship, but I hope someday you'll believe that I genuinely regret the pain I caused you. Marcus." I read the letter twice, then filed it away in a folder with other legal documents from the case. It was possible that prison and consequences had genuinely changed his perspective on relationships and exploitation. It was also possible that this was another manipulation attempt, designed to lay groundwork for future contact when he was released. Either way, it didn't matter to me anymore. I'd built a life that didn't depend on his character or his choices. Whether he'd genuinely changed or simply learned to express remorse more convincingly was irrelevant to my well-being or my future. I didn't write back. There was nothing I needed to say to him, no relationship I wanted to rebuild, no closure I required from someone who had spent years trying to destroy my independence and security. The conversation was finished, ended not by anger or bitterness, but by simple indifference to his opinions and feelings. My life had moved far beyond the space he'd once occupied in it. I had work that mattered, relationships that nourished me, and a home that reflected my choices and values. I had financial security, emotional stability, and the deep satisfaction that comes from surviving someone's attempt to diminish you and emerging stronger than before. On the 4th anniversary of the day Marcus first demanded my apartment, I threw a small celebration party. Miss Patterson brought her famous lemon cookies, Frank grilled hamburgers on my tiny back porch, and Janet flew in from Colorado to join several friends from my book club and volunteer work. We sat in my living room, the space that Marcus and Vivian had once measured for replacement furniture, and I looked around at people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide for them. These were relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, built slowly through shared interests and reciprocal care. "You know what's funny?" Janet said as we cleaned up after dinner. "Marcus spent so much energy trying to take your apartment away from you, but what he actually did was force you to build a much richer life than you had before." She was right. The crisis had forced me to evaluate all my relationships and priorities, to distinguish between genuine care and manipulative exploitation, to invest my emotional energy in people and activities that truly appreciated it. I'd discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, developed friendships that were deeper and more satisfying than the surface-level family obligation I'd mistaken for love. I'd found work that gave my life meaning beyond serving other people's needs, and I'd learned to value my own choices and preferences without constantly seeking approval from someone who would never provide it. The apartment itself had become more beautiful over the years, not because I'd made dramatic changes, but because I'd finally furnished it entirely according to my own taste without worrying about anyone else's judgment. Every book, every photograph, every piece of furniture reflected decisions I'd made for my own comfort and pleasure. Most importantly, I'd learned that security, financial, emotional, and physical, was something worth protecting from anyone who tried to take it away, regardless of their relationship to me or their reasons for wanting it. Love didn't require self-sacrifice to the point of self-destruction. Family relationships weren't automatically more valuable than other connections, simply because of shared genetics. As I locked my door that night and turned off the lights in my peaceful, secure apartment, I felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced me to learn these lessons. Marcus had intended to diminish my life, to reduce my choices and independence for his own benefit. Instead, he'd forced me to expand both my understanding of my own worth and my willingness to protect it. The last thing I did before going to bed was water the plants on my windowsill, the same herbs I'd been tending for years in the kitchen that had never belonged to anyone but me. They'd grown strong and abundant, thriving in the light and care I provided, rooted in soil that was theirs to flourish in. Tomorrow would bring new volunteer work with women learning to rebuild their lives after abuse, new adventures with friends who valued my company, new chapters in books I'd chosen to read and the home I'd chosen to keep. It would bring another day of living authentically, without fear or apology, in the space I'd created through decades of careful choices and defended through months of difficult battles. And if that wasn't a happy ending, it was certainly a victorious one. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.